Chronicles 1. They looked kind of similar. A slight difference here and there. Nothing significant. I'd rather just stick with 1 Kings. And it's a little more all-encompassing. I think some of what's... Every time I look down, I'm going to be getting silent. I think some of what's in First Chronicle, or not in 1 Chronicles 1, shows up later in First Chronicles. You notice how we're in 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles. Why is that? Or pardon me, 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, yeah. 2 Chronicles picks up with Solomon. 1 Chronicles covered what was in Samuel, along with a lot of genealogies. There's a distinction then in the two. Kings is a continuation of 1 and 2 Samuel, and you get 1 and 2 Kings. And it's much more the political and just the nuts and bolts of the daily life there and what was good and what was bad. And we'll see that as we go through Kings, we're going to get a lot of chapters where it'll be all there. And then there'll be points where it's in Chronicles and it's not mentioned in Kings. Kings is about society and the political environment, and in that, it ends up being almost a soap opera then. All the wickedness of their nation. But Chronicles was written later and emphasized the spiritual well-being of the kingdom of Israel. And so you get more in the way of, it's much more Jerusalem-centered, it's worship-centered, it's what the spiritual situation was. And so you'll get a very definite difference. You'll get complaint in Kings about how they were being run roughshod over or not. But in Chronicles, we'll emphasize what the spirituality of the people was. You know, you're more resolved to meet things when you're spiritually ready for it, sort of thing. So you get a different kind of emphasis for each of them. Anyway, 1 Kings 3, Solomon's startup, and there is problem in this right off the bat. I'll read from Deuteronomy in a bit, but he was God-fearing man, loved the Lord. This is emphasized here in this. You can't miss that. But he didn't follow like he should have. Am I hearing my voice over there delayed? And Solomon made affinity, it says, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. And Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He palled up with him a little bit. And took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had made an end of building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall of Jerusalem round about. And so this is key now. They still hadn't built the temple. Now, from the time of the judges, they met in certain high points and places, kind of like how they did under Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. There were places and hills where it was an important place for them to meet and have a sacrifice in honor to God. And they were still doing much of this. They did not have the temple built. They had the things of God, the Ark of the Covenant and such, at Jerusalem. David had seen to that with a little bit of a hiccup. But they did not have a proper temple yet, so they were meeting elsewhere. Later on, there will be a problem with it. When they do have the temple, that's where they need to meet. In the Pentateuch, God had made a point of saying, when you have that place that will be the place that I will identify, and you have all your stuff there, this is how it will take form. This will be the shape and the dimensions, and the curtains here and that sort of thing. and the altar and all of those things that were symbolic of Christ and Christ's sacrifice. But they did not have that yet. When they had that in place, though, the tendency was for Israel to fall away from God, to not serve him, to follow after the immorality and the idolatry of the people around them instead of keeping themselves straight before God. And I would say that's similar to even today. You sit there and go, oh, well, we know that doctrine's not right, but no, it's not right. Right is right and wrong is wrong. Yes, Al? They presumably had some semblance of it, but yeah, that was a tent for the wandering. There's nothing to indicate they kept all of that just as it was. It might have been, but it was limited in its use. So they obviously had some elements of it in order to have the sacrifices in the wilderness, but they may not have had the sufficient size and dimension of it. The ones that are always made note of are Solomon's Temple Mount, which was large, and then Herod, in order to make them happy, saw to it that it was a nice big one for them too, under Herod. But yeah, at this time, though, for historic purposes, they were meeting other places. So in verse 1, it mentioned the house of the Lord and the wall of Jerusalem round about. He was working on building that and hadn't finished. So in verse 2 then of chapter 3 of 1 Kings, only the people sacrificed in high places because there was no house built unto the name of the Lord until those days. It was after that. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places. And again, later on, when you see among the kings and the things that are noted later, when they did that, well, the worship of God had centered in Jerusalem once the Temple Mount was built. So they were going to these other places, like Gibeon, out of, well, that's where my granddaddy went. And he had a real favorite spot there in the groves. Always when you read groves in the Bible, I've got cousins with the last name Grove. There's nothing wrong with a grove. But for Israel, that was a place of false worship. That was the problem there. Having a nice grove of trees, if you're a farmer or such, might be a really good thing, especially if it's a hot day. But this was not that sort of thing. These were places dedicated to idolatry later. But here, he was going to worship properly with the Lord at that point. We can see that in God's conduct toward him. Verse 4, and the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon that altar. 1,000 burnt offerings. That's a lot. Even if it was just birds, that's 1,000 birds. That's a lot of birds. Verse 5, in Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give thee. Well, that's a rather great meeting, isn't it? The Lord says, okay, the halls of grace are open to you, Solomon. Give me a request. Well, key point in this was Solomon loved the Lord. He had a right heart toward God. He was acting in obedience. So much as could be done in that day, in that way, he was meeting with God. And that differs with, oh, I meet with God on the golf course now. Nope. That is not honoring God. Verse 6, and Solomon said, thou hast showed unto thy servant David, my father, great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. Key point in all this for the next couple of verses, Solomon's recognizing that David was an example. He was following his father's example. That's right out of the Old Testament. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. David's example. The writer of the Psalms gave the example for the writer of Proverbs. No accident there. not at all. God's blessing on each of them. Where David was plaintiff, Solomon was absolute. Solomon dwelled in that place of, we have God's blessing. I can count on God's blessing. I have only to be sure to give heed to wisdom, God's wisdom. And this is the key point in all this then. So, having emphasized God's blessing on David and on Israel and on him to allow him to serve in his father's place, and this is the same as in 2 Chronicles 1, we go down to verse 9, his request. And this differs from 2 Chronicles. Verse 9 here, though, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? So he doesn't say my people, he says thy people. And the speech, verse 10, and the speech pleased the Lord. Yeah, God can be pleased with our words. Why? Genuine, heartfelt, and right before him. A right heart, a right mind, having a right assessment of things. Where it gets wrong, Lord, you know I'm due this. How dare you withhold things from... You're going to demand from God? Zelensky had better chances than we would, demanding of God because he owes us. Risky at best. No. He's looking at God's blessing and saying, okay, now, Lord, please. This differs slightly with 2 Chronicles, because in Chronicles he asks for wisdom. Here he says understanding. Well, understanding just means hearing intelligently. You know, I mean, it's one thing to hear somebody. It's another thing entirely to hear with, okay, you're saying this. Now, where it's a person, it can mean the technicality of what they're speaking about, I understand. It can also mean the ramifications of your words and how they're how they actually set with reality have different meanings. Again, between President and Zelensky, the same thing. You're claiming what, but the situation is what, really. Ukraine was never in a position to face off against Putin, and Putin has no compassion. Even for his own people, I don't think he has compassion, but certainly not for the Ukrainians. They've demonstrated that. So, Mr. Zelensky, you say all we need to do is this? All? Is it all it takes is this? How dare we not do whatever you say, Mr. Zelensky, because look at Putin, Mr. Zelensky? Yeah, did you negotiate with Putin all those years that way, Mr. Zelensky? Now, mind you, Zelensky barely gotten into the office there. He's elected in 2019, and they were in war, so he didn't have much of a chance. But I don't think his attitude was much different from how it is now, certainly. Here, Solomon's like, Lord, just could you do this for me? Because I've got a responsibility for Israel, and this is your people, and wow, I need your help on this. So he is going to God saying, it isn't my people, it's your people, and I need to see to them according to what their need is. It's a big difference in how people conduct themselves. When the people in power say, we know better than you, and yeah, you're going to suffer for a while, but stiff upper lip, we're going to, pack our pockets, and you try to get by. I don't think this administration has that intent at all. People are fear-mongering, but I do not think that's their intent in any of it, not currently. I'm not saying they're going to do the right thing every time and do things perfectly. They've caught themselves in errors already, and there are probably others that just weren't caught yet. But human effort being what it is, you need understanding. In Chronicles, it says wisdom. Well, understanding will beget wisdom. And in fact, Verse 10, the speech pleased the Lord. So, verse 11, and God said to him, because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment. When he said good and bad, that's what he was talking about. Behold, verse 12, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart. The understanding would beget wisdom. That ultimately was what he was asking for. Chronicles does not err in that. It's scripture. And I'm sure it's the accurate recording of it. But that understanding was for the sake of wisdom. And the Lord understood this. So in delivering understanding, he was giving him wisdom as well. So verse 13. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if, conditional, the pastor's been going through how God made both guaranteed and conditional promises to Israel. You can call them covenants. It's basically a contract. God's promise, Israel would always have a special place, and still does. That's why all their enemies can line up against them, and Israel says, okay, you're all lined up, thank you. We're going to go straight down the whole line of you and take you out now. And they do. They can be overwhelmed by numbers, and nobody's taking them down. God will put them on the run. Conditional, though, if they don't walk with God, they're going to have a horrible time of it, and they're having a horrible time with it. They're taking back bodies now, bodies of babies from those butchers, Hamas, the people of Gaza. Just horrific things being done. It's conditional. If, verse 14, if thou wilt walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments as thy father David did walk, then I will lengthen thy days. And that's the case. 10 Commandments, honor thy father and thy mother. What's the rest of it? That thy days may be long upon the earth. Yep. People who sit there and go, my parents don't know nothing, I'll figure it out for myself. Good luck. Have fun. Sucker. No. You don't learn from your parents or learn from your parents, but learn. Your parents, very often, yeah, they can be like the Pharisees. Do after their words, not after their actions. Do as I say, not as I do. Yeah, that's a lousy example as a parent, but yeah, if your kids can discern between good and evil, maybe they can learn from it. And there are times when, we thought that was perfectly all right. Yeah, okay, no, it's not. Okay, lead in the paint, bad idea. Okay. Right, Al? How old is he? How old is he? Yeah, under the heading of, it's going to be a rough life. Yeah. Yeah. If thou wilt walk in my ways to keep my statutes, conditional. Verse 15 here, Solomon caught on. I need to get a little closer. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And he offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings and made a feast to all his servants. The people sacrificing, depending on the sacrifice, there were various stipulations. That kind of gets all played out in the Pentateuch. We're not going to go through all that. They were a shadow of things to come, but the body was of Christ, casting the shadow into the Old Testament. But the Ark of the Covenant and all of this was located there, and they could sacrifice, but it just wasn't built for all these things. He made a huge sacrifice of it. Some of the sacrifices were to be burned up. Some of the sacrifices could be eaten from. Some portions of some could be eaten. The heave offering could be eaten by the people bringing the sacrifices, so it depended on what kind of a sacrifice it was. So it'll mention sometimes being eaten of, some of it could, yes. Just that Solomon was not the one doing the sacrifices. That would have been wrong. And next we've got, for the rest of the chapter, I think something familiar to us, the two women, right? Harlots. So, they're great examples of motherhood already, but there was an issue because they both made claim. Now, being prostitutes, who else was the husband there? Were there family members? Yeah, nobody cared. It was the prostitutes' kids. I had in my youth, I didn't understand at the time, I had a couple of friends whose mom was a prostitute. I didn't understand at the time, but I figured that out years later. They had a lot of uncles, including the police. So they said. Well, they had these ones here in the Bible, each had a child. Condoms hadn't been invented. There wasn't the pill for the morning after. So they had children, and they were apparently sleeping with the child, which is a bad idea. One of them rolled over on the baby at night, right? So Solomon says, okay, one child dead. You're both claiming that child. There are probably no other witnesses. Nobody cares about your kids. And he made that decision. We'll cut the baby in half. Well, he wasn't really deciding that. This was much like, I think, the Doge thing this last week of, everybody, tell me 5 things you did this week. They admitted after the big blow-up, because some of the admin people were saying, yeah, don't answer him, don't answer, Kash Patel, who was at Exith, I think, the Department of Defense, they were saying no, because our guys know things that are top secret. We don't want to risk what they might reply. Besides the fact, if it's known that they're allowed to do that, you don't think there'd be emails from basically China claiming, oh yeah, I'm your supervisor, and please tell me all that you did this last week. No. We're not breaking that, because then we're letting ourselves in. So he said, nope, don't do that. But what happened, that made a big blow up, when really what they were doing was seeing how many people reply, because they suspect a lot of them aren't actually on the payroll, or they're not doing their jobs anyway. So that gave them some idea of, okay, this is who we start with. These are the departments we start with. And there is a lot needs to be done in that. I don't think it'll answer to everything they want to do for monies. I think there's a lot of promises in that are politics, We're going to send you checks and all that. Bad idea. But key point in it, get a reaction. And that's what Solomon did. He didn't have any intention of actually cutting the baby in half, I'm sure. That would be horrible. But maternal instincts. Now, in this case, by the narration, you can tell that was the mother of the baby. I would say at the very least, if you have one saying, yeah, that's a good idea, and one saying, no, that's horrible, the one who's going to take care of the baby is the one who says that's horrible. And that was all he wanted out of that. Who do I give this to? The one that says that's a bad idea. And so God blessed them in that. And everybody was like, oh, wow, he's a genius. Of course, the press in America is like, oh, they can't be geniuses. They're of the wrong party. They're picking sides. And they all do. Fox has their preference just like CNN does. It doesn't matter. Anyway, the rest, chapter 4 is more about the politics of it. I'm just going to pick and choose a couple of points here to bring up. Notice in verse 13 of chapter 4, Now these are the officers from all over Israel that were part of his court. These were the guys representing their areas. If there was something he needed to send somebody after it in a region, he had somebody from that region who could go there and say, I'm from the town over there. If you don't know me, here's a couple of the guys from your town that know me from over there. That sort of thing. Verse 13, though, the son of Geber in Ramoth Gilead, to him pertain the towns of Jair and the son of Manasseh, who are in Gilead. To him also pertain the region of Argob, which is in Bashan, 80 great cities, that's 60, with walls and brass and bars. Bashan is the Golan Heights today. That's like east of the Sea of Galilee. And Gilead, Ramoth Gilead, that's the east side of the Jordan River. That would be Gad and Manasseh over on that side. Verse 20, Judah and Israel were many as the sand which is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. They had a good life. Verse 21, the area he reigned over. And Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. The river at the top, and it repeated 2 or 3 times. Look down in verse 24. And he had dominion, in other words, rule and control over all the region on this side of the river from Tiphsah even to Azah, over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. When it mentions Tiphsah, that's on the Euphrates River. So when it mentions in verse 21 and again here in 24, it's talking about all the way up through Syria and into what is now western Iraq. They were answering to him. They had their kingdoms, but they had to check with him. But what did this mean? Well, verse 26, and Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen, cavalry. And those officers provided victual, it says there, but that's victual. It's just spelled, that's how it's spelled. That's an actual word, yep, it's food, for King Solomon. And so he had a huge supply. Solomon authorized them to go down and get horses for him. It emphasizes that in Chronicles. I'm not going to turn to it. He was wise. God gave him wisdom. He loved the Lord. Was he perfect? He didn't follow the Lord perfectly. He did not. Case in point then. As soon as I find that. Chronicles 17:16. You don't need to turn to it. I'll just read very quickly. And he, meaning the king, when they come into the land, and he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. Now understand, Solomon had sent to Egypt for it and had them bring them up, so he didn't send people himself down there. But it starts with the basic premise there in Deuteronomy, but he shall not multiply horses to himself. Solomon, in a time when he had absolute sway for hundreds of miles, from Egypt to the Euphrates River, from the Nile to the Euphrates, he decided he needed a huge standing army with all the expense involved, and they were doing well. They had an economic boom there at that time. So, yes, and they had no war. That was a big thing. They had the capability. They could just have chariots sitting around, shine them up every once in a while, clean them off, take the rust off them, replace one every so often. Everything was good. But later on, wouldn't be so good. It'd get tough. He didn't keep things entirely right with God. And we're going to see that with upcoming when we get to the next kings. Al? If it's the next king, yeah. Why? What is it? Okay, yeah. Well, we're done. We're out of time. Yeah. 3,000 of them, so not all of what he wrote was in Proverbs. Proverbs was what was inspired of God. We'll cover the next 2 or 3 chapters according to the list there for Kings and Chronicles next week. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word, for your counsel, Lord. We look for your blessing in it, your aid in understanding and in wisdom, Lord. We pray for your guidance to follow the light that's on our path for this day. In Christ's name.